My Life Story by Mary J. Resin. The first 5 years of my life were spent living on the outskirts of a small town. Work was hard to find, and when Dad found a job in town, Mother decided to move. My mother had a very close relationship with her girlfriend. They were inseparable. If Mother lived in the front of a house, her girlfriend would live in the back. They were always together until her friend became ill with pneumonia and died. Mother went to the funeral, and when she returned, she became ill herself. I'll never forget the day of my mother's funeral. I was only 5 years old. One of the ladies picked me up and took me to the open casket and said, "Look, this is the last time you'll see your mother." I cried so hard, even though it was so many years ago, I can still see my mother's face. How could people be so mean? I was Dad's only little girl. I remember how every time he'd come home from work, he would bring something, a cookie or an apple. This continued on after my mother died, up until about a year later when Dad met a woman and they were married. Then the trouble began. Dad could no longer bring me anything because she had a little girl too. At my age, I could not understand why he stopped bringing me gifts. In our family, we had 5 children and she had 4. Together, they had 2 more, making it 11 children altogether. I remember his wife being a good housekeeper and she kept us very clean. By the age of 10, I had become very religious. We had a big barn where items were stored and the wash was hung. In the corner, I made an altar out of a box and decorated it so pretty with holy pictures, green wreaths, and daisies. I used to sit there for hours praying. One day, the school had an outing to visit a church where people were cured of illness. A nun came to me and asked me to pray for her as she was supposed to get her black habit. I was so thrilled. I wanted to be a nun too. I would sit and crochet for hours on end to help the church bazaar. I said, "When I graduate, I will enter the convent." One evening, I told my dad of my wish to enter the convent. He did not say yes, and he did not say no. He only asked that I go to my first dance and meet boys. I did, and after a few parties, the nun bit was forgotten. At the age of 14, I was getting ready for my graduation. I begged my mother to let me have some of the beautiful peonies from our garden, but she would not allow it. I remember being the only girl on stage without flowers. I felt so cheated. I cried all night long until I fell asleep. I heard my mother telling my father, if I would have known, I would have let her have some flowers. I remember in a half sleep getting out of bed and taking my diploma out of my drawer and feeling as if my own mother were right there comforting me. My stepmother always picked on me. I oftentimes wanted to run away. I would hide my clothes outside, but every time I did it, it would rain. I thought it was a sign from God that I mustn't run away. A boyfriend who was always there for me and of whom I would ask advice told me also that I should stay home. Finally, I was old enough to get housework. I was so excited because I wanted to have a room of my own. And at home, we always had to share and there was no privacy. I did housework for 5 months before I got employment at a factory where we worked on pianos and radios. It was better than nothing. I felt very important when I handed my check over to my mother. I was allowed 10% or $2 to $3 out of which I would buy my cosmetics. In between housework and the factory, I felt quite grown up. One day, when very tired after work, my mother asked me to scrub the floor of our store. I was angry. She was always picking on me, and I told her that she should ask her own daughter to do it. Well, one thing led to another, and we had a big fight. I heard my father and mother arguing about it. My mother said, "She's always praying, but she has the devil in her." I thought she was jealous because ever since I was small, it was always this or always that. As I grew older, I understood that it was very hard to raise a big family and that there's always one you seem to pick on. That evening, I told my father I would move to my older sisters. Without saying another word to anyone, I gathered my clothes and I went to my sister's house. I was so afraid that my father would come with a policeman to order me home, but he did not. I stayed for 1 month, but it became hard for my family. I only made one paycheck, but it always helped. Things were better until I got laid off. My mother went back to picking on me, so I took housework with a nice family. One day, mother's sister came from New York to visit. During her stay, she asked me if I would like to go to New York with her. I was very excited about the possibility, so I talked it over with my dad. At first, he didn't like the idea. But then, after about a week and a big long sermon about being careful and not talking to strangers and so forth, he finally gave me permission to go to the city. After all my father's preaching, when I got to New York, I was a nervous wreck. I thought, thought if somebody merely looked at me that they were on the make. I would get off the train and felt like people were following me. Just going to church for an hour was a big ordeal. Later, I realized that it was all in my head and very ridiculous. I liked New York, and I worked there for almost 3 years. The people I worked for in New York were very good to me. They wanted to adopt me and make me their own. I could have had anything I ever wanted. They owned a factory on Fifth Avenue making pants. They were wonderful people, and I might have considered this, but they were Jewish, and I would never leave my Catholic faith. They were lonely, and I tried to be good to them. We had a lot of fun, and they took me all through New York. After working about 6 months, I met the superintendent's son. I was very taken with him, and he treated me like a queen. On our first date, he took me to Hollywood Restaurant, a very expensive restaurant. I bought a beautiful black lace dress from one of the better stores at $50, which at that time was a fortune. We took a cab and he bought me a corsage. I felt like $1 million. It sure seemed like he had a lot of money. The next day, his mother told me that he spent his entire week's paycheck on me, but we didn't care. It was an evening we would never forget. Harry and I went together for 6 months before he asked me to marry him. On the night of our engagement, we went to celebrate at his sister's house that lived in Brooklyn. She was a fussy woman who never had to work a day in her life. After our visit, we went to a Chinese restaurant and didn't get home till 3 a.m. Harry wasn't Catholic and he fainted at his first time in church. His family said that he sometimes did this. It wasn't until 2 months after we were married that I found out he had epilepsy, something I had never heard of, but broke my heart many times. Father Siri really befriended my husband when he was taking religious instruction. This pleased me. I remember I had to have my sister bring my baptismal and birth certificates from Buffalo. She also brought a $12 wedding gift from my father. We were married on June 1st. It was a beautiful wedding. Our table was set in horseshoe style. After paying for the wedding, all we had left was 25 cents. His mother bought us breakfast the next morning, and we laughed about his father not attending the wedding because Harry converted to a Catholic. He was a stubborn man. Harry worked for him for 3 months until he was offered a superintendent job for 48 apartments. The building was beautiful, and I loved it. It was my first real apartment and my first real home. I was very happy there. Since there were hardly any repairs in the new building and Harry could handle it, I decided to work at the American Women's Club to keep from being lonesome. It was hard to work there. The girls wouldn't tell you anything. I used to carry my tray in front of me until the elevator boy told me how to do it properly. However, I enjoyed my work and I was well liked. Pretty soon, I was able to work banquets where the big stars would arrive. This was a real pleasure. Soon, though, I became pregnant. I was able to work for 4 months, but when I started to show, someone squealed on me and I was laid off. I was 130 pounds when I got married, but after the birth of our little son, I was 180 and I couldn't trim it off. We were very happy in our new home for quite a while. We had 2 bedrooms, and one of my girlfriends and her sister moved in with us. It was nice, and I wasn't lonesome anymore. I wasn't jealous with them there. Harry was never the type to cheat, and I knew he loved me more than ever. I'll never forget the day someone called me on the intercom to tell me that there was a man lying in the courtyard. I rushed to put a pillow under his head because it looked like he had fainted, but the doctor advised me that he had jumped from the 6th floor. On that day, and for about a year after, I would see him there in the courtyard, and it would give me the chills. Harry's mother decided she wanted to move to Sweden to retire. My father in law was relentless, saying the children were more polite there, and the country was so clean, and you could eat off the sidewalks, and it was better because of this, and it was better because of that. I tried to tell him that things change and it was no better there than here, but he was stubborn and always right. It was right before this that Harry was offered a job taking care of elevators in Radio City. We were so excited. We went to see the owner right away. All was going great, but all of the excitement brought on a seizure, and Harry lost the position. He looked to me as if he wanted to die. I will never forget his face or the tears in his eyes. So when Harry's parents went to Sweden, we moved in and Harry took over his father's 80 apartments. It was a bigger salary and it meant more work. We had a fireman, two elevator men, and a porter to keep the halls clean. It was nice, and we had a big courtyard where I screened an area for my boy to play in. Guess there was a small opening because on one day, Kenneth wiggled his little self through it. One more inch and he would have fallen 6 feet. I don't know how I stayed so calm to grab his arm and get him back. When I went inside, I was shaking and I couldn't speak. The next day, Harry put up the chicken wire. My little boy, 2 years old, was something else. He was so smart, he would sneak out and get as far as the park and the steps that took you out to Broadway, where the police inevitably would bring him in. My boy loved this because they would give him his ice cream. Finally, they asked me to keep a better eye on him, and I did try, but he always got away. Once in a walker, he fell down 2 flights of stairs into the boiler room. I was never so scared, but he didn't get hurt. He was just a little shook up, and he stood right up again. I decided it was best to send him to a day nursery, which worked out well. Seemed like everything started to go wrong all at once right after that. While Harry was putting up an aerial, he fell down, broke his arm, and dislocated his shoulder. I had to learn a new trade and quick, but I was no match for a man. On Christmas Eve, most of our help was off, and I was left alone to fire the boilers for almost 80 apartments. I remember being dead tired and ready to cry when my two cousins showed up. God sure can make things happen. The boys rolled out the coal all night. They were dead tired, but I was so thankful they came. I bet they won't forget Christmas in New York. After a while, Harry developed a pattern. He would go upstairs to fix something, and then the tenant would give him a drink instead of a tip. By the end of the night, he was drunk. I couldn't stand it. After a while, I took our Christmas tips and I went home to see my folks. My brother, who was an assistant vice president, told me he would give Harry a good job if Harry was a good mechanic. He was indeed a good mechanic, and he took engineering at night school. He was very smart. Without thinking of epilepsy, I talked Harry into moving on January 15th. We packed our bags. When we got to Buffalo, the job was not there. I started to work at a television factory. I had to walk so far, it felt like my feet were frozen. And Harry found work at J.H. Williams. That is, until one day when Harry was painting, he had a seizure and was fired. I knew then that I was wrong to come to Buffalo. In New York, you could adapt, but here I was stuck until my brother finally gave him employment reading blueprints. Harry loved this work, and things were looking up for a while until the work became slow and he took a job with Curtis Wright. They also loved his work and allowed him to stay even though he had epilepsy. They would let him just sit and sit out the spell until it would pass. They were very good to him. One day, Harry came home looking very tired and complaining of his feet. He ended up with a stroke and in bed for a week. He couldn't move his feet and he couldn't feel them when the doctor put the needles in them. I took him to the hospital, and after x-rays, the doctor told me he would not live long. I kept calling his sister to come, but since the soldiers had the first choice, she wanted to wait until she could have a seat on the train. This all happened on a Thursday, and I remember I took my boy to see his father. They gave him ice cream and only allowed him to sit in the hall. I got home that night and I was so exhausted I couldn't even undress. I just lay across the bed. At 4 a.m., a policeman came and said that my husband was dead. They left me there just like that in the middle of the night. I had to ask someone to take me, and finally, a very nice person drove me to make the arrangements for the undertaker. We brought the body home. In those days, they didn't have funeral homes, but people came to your house instead, at all hours. I think that's why they call it a wake. I was very hard on a person. Harry was buried on December 2nd, 1944, 7 months after the birth of our daughter. It was a very sad Christmas. I worked as a supervisor in a laundry with about 15 girls under me. During my time there, I noticed my legs were starting to hurt. Gradually, it worsened and spread into my hips. The doctor said I had rheumatic fever and shouldn't work. I figured the doctor didn't know so much, and I continued to work until I got worse and finally got so bad that I couldn't feed myself or comb my hair. It was when I called another doctor because my boy was sick with high fever that I found out what was wrong. When the doctor saw me propped up in a chair, he examined me and told me that I needed to have my tonsils out. I thought he was a quack, but I said, if it'll help me, I'll do it. I remember going to the hospital on Columbus Day, and it was after that that I finally started to get my strength back. I was crippled for a long time and people thought I would never walk again, but slowly I got back to normal. I cashed a small insurance policy when my husband died and put a small down payment on a house. When a girlfriend came to see me and cried about being evicted, I gave her my apartment and moved into their garage apartment. It was big enough for me and my two children, and the rent would help pay the bills. It was a blessing, and life was better. I began to go out with the girls and had a lot of fun. I felt like living again. My girlfriend asked me to go to a tavern because she loved a boy there. I wasn't much of a drinker, so I drank Coca Cola. A man came to our table saying he was going to marry me. I thought this boy is crazy, and I told him to get lost. The next day, he came over to our porch with a soft drink. I got to know him. He was a very nice man with a very good education, but he was 8 years younger than me. He asked me to the movies, and I really enjoyed his company. Then he started to come over to the house. We broke up a few times. His mother did not approve of an older widowed woman with two children on top of it all. This is not what she wanted for her boy, and I could understand that too. I know how I would feel if it were my son, but he was a lonely boy, maybe a little fat and not very popular with the girls. We started to spend more time together, and I really liked him a lot. We went together for about a year before we were engaged. His mother gave us a shower and had a small wedding in her house. After knowing me better, she learned to love me a lot. We went to New York for 2 weeks on our honeymoon when he had a wonderful time. I wanted to look nice, so I got a fresh permanent, and my hair was so frizzy I had to wear a wig. Harry's parents did not approve of my getting married. Edward was crazy about my daughter, but not too sure about my son. I would see that he was ignoring the boy, maybe not on purpose, but the boy always felt bad. I remember thinking that a woman should never remarry when she has children because no matter how much you love each other, there's always a barrier. Edward developed a pattern where he would go to work, come home, take a nap, and go out to the taverns. He was more a boarder than a husband sometimes, and we would argue often. Once I was so upset, I took all of his clothes and put them in a buggy. I took the buggy to the tavern and told him to stay there. Well, he came home madder than hell. I realized later that this was a mistake because I had to iron all those shirts. I just gave myself more work. When my boy was 18 and announced to me that he was getting married, maybe I should have stopped him, but I didn't. I thought maybe he could make a better life for himself. I gave him a wedding in our home. He moved into the garage apartment and eventually moved to the state of Washington. The worst argument with Edward was when I had worked as a cook and decided to use my paycheck to buy a refrigerator. I couldn't afford all of it, but gave the money to the clerk and said I would bring the rest later. My husband refused, so I lost the down payment. I cried and cried. I cried to see my son, and a couple of my boy's friends asked me if I would like to go with them. So the next day, his friends took me to Washington for 2 weeks. Then I made up with Edward. He met me at the airport and he was so nice. He used to argue with my daughter, but with me being away, they got to know and understand each other. Things were pretty good then, but it didn't last until I decided to leave him for good. He had a fit over a bill for some clothes I had bought my daughter. I should have asked, but it was always no, no, no. She was standing up in a wedding and needed those things. So I had enough. I was leaving. I remember it was right after Thanksgiving. I left with my son. My daughter was working, so she couldn't come. I packed all my things into one room, packed my bag, and then I left. I was never coming home. In Washington, I got work in an old folks' home. I loved old people, and I worked there for 3 months. Edward kept writing me. I loved Washington. When my son's car caught fire, the missionary gave him a house on Vashon Island. Later, the missionary made it a place for children. It was so beautiful. The garden was filled with flowers, and there was a stairway to the beach where you'd see wild canaries along the way. I felt I could have lived there forever. In the end, I went back to my husband, and it was the best thing I could do. He turned around and took on responsibilities. Seemed like he really grew up while I was gone. From that day on, I had the best husband in the whole world. My daughter got married to a very nice man and had an October wedding. I bought her a beautiful dress, but when she and her boyfriend went to pick it up, it was raining and it ended up with red spots all over the train. Cost me plenty to have it fixed, but the wedding was beautiful and she was a beautiful bride. With a tiara in her hair, she looked like a queen. With my daughter married, all that was left was little Eddie. Edward and I got along very good, and he loved his little boy so much. There was a beautiful bond between them, and Edward would have given him anything. Edward worked in an office for 12 years before the company cut back and made him work in the factory. After about a year, he started having aches and pains in his feet. They wanted to operate on them, but after the x rays, they found blood clots on his side. They cut him open from one side to the other, and he was never the same after that operation. Being diabetic, Edward worsened and suffered one stroke after another. He would sit for hours and watch westerns and movies. I often wondered if he understood it, but I never questioned him. I let him have anything he wanted. After a severe stroke, they took him to the hospital where he died. People gave us 7 years and we were married for 30. I'll never forget the 25th anniversary party my daughter planned for us. It was beautiful. I know Edward appreciated it too. My children are all married now and all very happy, and I sit here old and sick. I had to sell my home, but my daughter gave me a beautiful room in her house, like an apartment. They treat me like a queen. Her two children are angels. They're so good to me. All total, I have 11 grandchildren and two great grandchildren. I've had a really very full life. The end.